Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Juneteenth by Ralph Ellison. Now this is a controversial book. It was published posthumously some 5 years after Ellison's death in 1994. There are some who don't regard it as a novel. They don't regard it as Ellison's unpublished second novel, unfinished second novel. They see the influence of his literary executor, friend, and editor, John Callahan on these pages. And it's true, Ellison never finished his second novel. He never had a follow-up to his masterpiece debut, Invisible Man. He was haunted by the reception of Invisible Man. He was constantly trying to craft a novel that would be a worthy successor. In the final 40 years of his life, he wrote, rewrote, perfected, tinkered with, made tiny revisions to over 1,000 pages. And these are some of them in Juneteenth. Yes, this is a posthumous publication. Yes, it's not quite a perfect novel. It draws from the middle third of those 1,000 pages to create a somewhat coherent narrative. It draws from the very beginning of that 1,000 pages to give us an opening. And it has an ambiguous ending. It doesn't resolve all of the questions. We don't have everything we would desire in a novel tied up neatly and answered. And yet, Ellison had one of the most perceptive minds of the 20th century, in the US or globally. He had a foundation in music, and that comes through in his language, in his metaphors. His experiences in African-American churches, at Tuskegee, and all of his different experiences throughout his upbringing had crafted this incredible mind that could produce flights of prose that are almost unmatched in 20th century literature. He's traded in his existentialism and the deep influences of Dostoevsky for the modernism of James Joyce, William Faulkner, and others in Juneteenth. And in these pages, there are absolute masterful flights. There are passages and pages that I will never be able to forget. And so I cannot recommend this book highly enough. If you're a fan of any of those modernist writers, if you've read Invisible Man and been put off by the idea that Juneteenth wasn't quite a second novel, please open this one up and enjoy what there is. Ellison gives us a fascinating pair of characters. We have Senator Adam Sunrader, who was raised as a young boy named Bliss. And we have the man who raised him, a black minister, Reverend Alonzo Hickman, A.H., A.Z., referred to by different friends and colleagues throughout the book. And we see that they're each haunted by their past, by the choices each has made in relation to the other. That Bliss, having been raised in the black church, raised as sort of an itinerant young minister, Reverend Bliss, has abandoned all of that, has abandoned the community that raised him and helped make him one of their own, to become a senator from the North, but a senator who is a race baiter. Set in the 1950s, we see the horrors of segregation in this entrenched stand and the racism of the Jim Crow, not just in the South, but throughout the US. And we see how Adam Sunrader draws on stereotypes, draws on horror, and tries to spew this out, to sway. He's taken the cadences, the rhythms of being a preacher and turned that into a rhetoric that demonizes the community that protected him and saved him as a child. And there's the ambiguities. Is Sunrader himself black? Is he biracial? We never quite have those types of questions answered, but Ellison has us probing. And through the conversations between Sunrader and Hickman, through their memories, their recollections of their past and different events, sometimes each remembering the same event from their own points of view, we see this beautiful questioning of what it means to be a human, to be a parent, to be part of a community, and what it means to forsake one's identity, to betray others. What is that cost? And so the book is an absolute masterpiece. I want to read a couple of passages that give a sense of what it sounds like, what Ellison sounds like at the heart of his writing. We were under the trees, away from the town, away from Donaldson, Carp, and the camera. There, how glorious to have been there. Below, the park space showed, shade here, sun there, in a dreamy, dappled, mid-afternoon haze. We were there, high up the trees, flurried with birdsong, and one clear note sang above the rest, a lucid, soaring strand of sound, while in the grass cicadas dreamed. For a moment we stood there, looking down the gentle rising, falling of the land, while far away a cowbell tinkled, small across some hidden field beyond the woods. Milkweed ran across the ground. Imagine to remember. Was it ever? Still. Thistle, purple blue. Flowers blew, wisteria loud against an old rock wall. Was this the season or another time? Certainly, there were the early violets among the fallen pine needles, ago too. But that was Alabama, and lonesome. Here she was close beside me, and as we moved down the grassy slope, the touch of her cool, sweat-dampened arm came soft against me, and went and came coolly again, and then again as we went down the hill into the sun. Oh, keep coming, coming. Then through the sun into the dappled shade. How long ago? This comes a fall. Aches here, aches in spring like a lost limb refusing to recognize its dismemberment, no need to deny. Then too, but sweet. Coming just above my shoulder, her glossy head, her hair in 2 heavy braids, and I seeing the small gold rings stuck snug in the pink-brown berry of her ear, a smile dreaming on her serenely profiled face, and I remembered the Bliss years. He, Bliss, returned. Later on, and I could tell you how I drew her close then, and how her surrender was no surrender, but something more, a materialization of the heart, the deeper heart that lives in dreams, or once it did, that roams out in the hills among the trees, that sails calm seas in the sunlight, that sings in the stillness of star-cast night, the heart's own that rejoins its excited mate once in a lifetime, like Adam's rib returned, transformed and glorious. I can tell you of her black hair waved out upon the grass with leaves in it, the demands of her hand soft and soothing, with the back of my neck in it, her breath's sweet fever inflaming my face. Even after all these years, I can tell you of passion so fierce that it danced with gentleness, and how the whole hill throbbed with silence, the day gathering down, ordered and moving, radiant beneath the firm pumping of our enraptured thighs. I can tell you how I became she and she me with no questions asked and no battle fought. We grasped the secret of that moment, and it was enough. I can tell you as though it were only an hour past, of her feel within my arms, a girl woman soft and yielding, innocent, unashamed, yet possessing the necessary knowledge. How I was at rest then, enclosed in peace, obsessionless, and accepting a definition for once and for once happy. How the likes of me could say I love, and having loved, moved on. And there's more than one tragedy at the heart of Juneteenth, and despite the fact that the novel was perhaps certainly unfinished, Ellison had crafted enough of these characters. He had crafted what he viewed as an antiphony, very explicitly, a musical antiphony, something that had arisen out of jazz, his experiences in jazz music, but even beyond that, out of the spirituals, the songs, the call and response that existed within the earliest elements of African American songs here in the U.S., but also in their traditions in Africa. And that specific call and response that occurs within revival meetings, within the church, here exists in this call and response, both between Sunrader or Bliss, in his better versions of himself, and Hickman, but also in their own memories with each other. There is an antiphony between the two of them, and I'll read a passage that reveals that. The way that they question each other, push at each other, correct each other, seem in some way to recognize that the other will bring out either the best or the worst, and there's a choice to be made about which it will be. Certainly the worst has been brought out in Sunrader in the past, but perhaps here in these final hours, lying in a hospital bed, he can recover the best that there once was, and retain that aspect of his identity and his history. But there's an antiphony as well between each man's recollections of his own memories. He considers who he is now and who he once was. And this call and response about the way that the memories flood forward and how they've been suppressed in the past or amplified, certain tiny little fractal moments that have pushed out and defined them in their present choices. And it's absolutely incredible how that deep psychology exists here. It is, as I said, very deeply influenced by the type of stream of consciousness that we see in a writer like James Joyce, or certainly William Faulkner. Ellison had read both, he'd written comments on both. And yet here he's taking those ideas and certainly advancing them from his own perspective, from his own past, in very powerful and meaningful ways. And it's not a spoiler to say that part of the tragedy of the book is not just that Sunrader, Bliss has become Sunrader, and he is in a very real sense eclipsed the sun and is turned away from the light and blocked the light from others to become this evil, cruel rhetorician and politician. That he's corrupted himself and his powers and his talents in order to pursue power and evil causes. But there's also a tragedy in that at the very beginning, and it's not a spoiler because it happens in the very first sentence, which is 2 days before the shooting, or in some early manuscripts, 3 days before the shooting. Most of the book is taking place in Juneteenth on a hospital bed as Sunraider lays dying after an assassination attempt in the floor of the Senate. And having been gunned down during a vicious racist speech, he's now lying here in the hospital with the man who was his father figure, and they're having these conversations with each other as he drifts in and out of consciousness. And Hickman is sitting there as when Bliss will drift out of consciousness, or Sunraider will drift out of consciousness. Hickman's sitting there remembering what they've just been talking about. And so there's a tragedy there as well. But here's an example as they recall a series of revival meetings they shared. One in which the Right Reverend John Eatmore was most full of his ministerial eloquence. Give a man wood and he will learn to make fire. Eatmore's most Promethean vision. Hot here. No, Reverend Hickman seemed to say, his eyes twinkling, that's one I've forgotten. I reckon I'm getting old. But Eatmore was the kind of man who was always true to his name and reputation. He put himself into everything he did. Preach me a little of it, Bliss. I'll lean close to you so you won't have to use up your voice. Let me hear you. It'll probably do us both some good. Go on, son. But how, the senator thought. Where are the old ones to inspire me? Where are the Amen corner and old exhorters, the enviable shouting sister with the nervous foot tapping out the agitation on which my voice could ride? I don't think I can, he said, but his throat was silent, and yet Hickman seemed to get it, to understand. I taught you how, Bliss. You started. You draw your strength and inspiration out of the folks. If they're cold, you heat them up. When they get hot, you guide the flame. It's still the same. You did it in the Senate when you told them about those Nazi fellows and swung the vote. What? The senator said. You knew even then? Eatmore, Bliss, never mind the rest. Just let's talk about you preaching Eatmore in a white church. Do I have to start you off like I used to when you were a baby? Didn't Eatmore begin something like this? He'd be walking back and forth with his head looking up at the ceiling and his hands touching prayer-like together, then stop suddenly and face them, still looking out over their heads, saying, brothers and sisters, I want to take you on a trip this morning. I want to take you back to the dawn of time. I want to let you move at God's rate of speed. Yes, let's go way back to the time of that twilight that had settled down upon the earth after Eden. Ah, yes. I want you to see those times, because time is like a merry-go-round within a merry-go-round. It moves, but it is somehow the same even if you're riding on an iron tiger. Eden's fruit had done gone bad with worms and flies. Yes, the flowers that had been the dazzling glory of Eden had run wild and lost their God-given bloom. Everything was in a shambles. It was a mess. And so they continue on as Hickman starts this and he pushes forward. And he continues to go, yes, man had sinned and he had strayed. He was just doing the best he could, and that wasn't much. Now that's enough for me, Bliss. You take it from here. Let's hear the old Eatmore boy. It's been a long time. Bliss, all time is the same. Preach. Time is just like Eatmore used to say. A merry-go-round within a merry-go-round. Only people fall off or out of time. Men forget, or go blind like I'm going. But time turns, Bliss, and remembering helps us save ourselves. Somewhere through all the falseness and forgetting, there is something solid and good. So preach me some, Eatmore. You won't like it, the senator said, closing his eyes. I'll be the judge, Hickman said. And Bliss responds to this. Amen, yes, man had sinned, brothers and sisters, and he had strayed, but he was still the handiwork of a merciful God. He carried within him two fatal weaknesses. He was of little faith, and he had been contaminated by the great gust of stardust that swept over the earth, when proud Lucifer fell like a blazing comet from the skies. For man had breathed the dust of pride, and it wheezed in his lungs like a hellish asthma. Thus, even though he mingled with the beasts of the forest, and Eden had become a forgotten condition, rankling with weeds and tares, a lost continent, a time out of his brutish mind, still he retained his pride and his knowledge that he was conceived in the image of God. And so he continues on, and they have this conversation through remembering and misremembering and correcting this sermon that they each claim to have preached at some different point. And they're drawing on each other, drawing this strength. And as he had noted, that there's this idea about that through the false forgetting, there's something solid and good. This idea that by remembering something that is true, they can perhaps recapture who they were and save the best of themselves. And it's fascinating to see this. It's fascinating to see how Ellison uses those different aspects of his background, of his experience, to push these two characters forward in this midnight, dark night of the soul between the two of them. And there are other pages and passages that are unbelievable. I haven't read from either of the three sections really, that are really the finest chapters of this book, because I want you to experience them. I'm hoping folks will be checking this out from the library, finding a copy, and just sinking into Ellison, because it is that powerful. That there's a passion beneath so many of these pages. There's an absolute dread of the racism that Ellison had encountered, that his family had encountered, that his peers were encountering. There's an appreciation for the power of music, the power of community, the power of language. That's something that Ellison obsessed over for 40 years creating this. And that perfectionism shows, where we see two men who have this gift, not just of gab, but of this ability to inspire and move with their words. And they each see the failures that their words have brought them to, and yet they recognize that perhaps it's all they have left for each other, are the words and the language they can draw on. And so it's masterful. There's a chapter set at a massive revival meeting on Juneteenth, which is what gives the book its novel. There's this beautiful passage, chapter called Night Talk, where they recall this moment where Bliss had started to realize that he could pass for white. Whether or not his father was black, he could pass for white. And it's never quite answered, was his father black? Is he someone who was white but raised within a black community and has now betrayed and abandoned these people who very frankly saved him as a baby and kept him alive as a child? Or has he actually betrayed, this biological aspect of his identity? And so that question's never resolved, but Ellison kind of points out that it doesn't matter. The betrayal still stings and is horrifying. And so I want to read one passage from the chapter where Hickman is thinking about things. He goes, "Why, son, don't play me for a fool. Why not? Because this is American cloth. The human cloth is woven too fine for that. That's why. Because you are one of the few who knows where the cry of pain and anguish is still echoing and sounding over all that bloodletting and killing that set you free, to set yourself free. That's why again. Because you know that we were born of sacrifice and that we had to live by a different truth, and that truth is good, and the vision of manhood it stands for is more human, more desirable, more real. So you're in it, Hickman, and have been in it, and there's no turning back. Besides, there's no single living man calling the tune to this crazy dance. Talking about playing it by ear, this is one time when everybody is playing it by ear, because everybody in the band and out on the dance floor is as blind as a mole in a hole. But why couldn't he have seen if only for a moment? Why, if he had, then all of this might not have happened. Oh, but it's the little things that find us out, the little things we refuse to do in order to avoid doing the big things that can save us. Well, there's nothing to do but wait and see. He's holding on, even though death is around somewhere close by, as he always is. I'll just have to try once more to outweight him, to outface him, even though I've seen him enough, even for an old preacher like me." And so Hickman has these self-recriminations, and yet he recognizes that within the history of the U.S. and his reflections on how slavery was ended in the U.S., but the aspects of segregation, the lynching that his brother experienced, that he remembers in one chapter, and what the connection is to Bliss in that horror, and the just absolutely terrifying fate that befell Hickman's brother. We see this way that he reflects all of these ideas and yet continues to love the man who was once a boy he raised. And so, as I said, I cannot encourage folks highly enough to read this book. I do think there's an ending. Yes, these might be the edited arrangements of John Callahan, but I am so grateful he did that, because this book is absolutely incredible. It belongs side by side with Invisible Man on the Shelf. Now, of course, there are many works I was thinking of, not least being Invisible Man, one of the finest works of the 20th century. If you've never read that, certainly expand. Try that out. Ellison's essays reveal the same level of perception, playing with language, constantly tinkering with his place in his community, his place in history. And so Shadow and Act, I have a video on this, but Going to the Territory, a later series of essays, both reveal so many fascinating aspects of Ellison's ideas. His stories in Flying Home do not collect the 8 published excerpts from Juneteenth, including those that had been published that were not included in Juneteenth because they didn't fit within the narrative that Callahan was trying to build from the pages Ellison had crafted. Certainly the influence of Richard Wright continues to be present, whether it's the more experimental ideas he had in a work like Laud Today or The Outsider, an early and a later work, or the deep pathos of Native Son. Ellison's grasp of poetry, the cadence of poetry and the music of poetry certainly draws on poets like T.S. Eliot, who was probably Ellison's favorite poet, but also African-American poets, top to bottom. Now, if you are, like me, someone who was blown away by this work, you can find all the works that Ellison had in 3 days before the shooting. This collects over 1,000 pages of Ellison's, what he had written, various revisions, alternate pieces, and the 8 published excerpts, including Night Talk, Juneteenth, the Bliss's Birth chapter, which probably, for my mind, was maybe my favorite section of the book, and one that I hope others will appreciate. But also famously Cadillac Flambe, which was not included in Juneteenth, but is an absolute masterpiece, sort of a short story all on its own. And I'll be spending some time with that. That'll be a whole separate video. Ellison's letters reveal his haunting, the deep dread he felt over Invisible Man, the way he was constantly trying to write his way forward, but also just the way that he very carefully cultivated his standing, and the way that the erasure of people who he wanted to be clear were not influencing him, whether it was Richard Wright or later on a particular number of writers who were women, including someone like Toni Morrison, who Ellison did not uplift. And he was sort of very protective of where he felt he stood in the literary pantheon, to, I think, a detriment, frankly. There's a key element of the book, honestly, that reminds me of the film My Dinner with Andre, except it's far more dynamic. But these conversations between two men, the memories, the way that they're crafting their future and their history out of their memories and conversing with each other, reminds me of what happens in the film My Dinner with Andre. Another work that I was reminded of would be the more recent contemporary work, Marlon James' Brief History of Seven Killings. Certainly, I think the influence of Faulkner was evident on this, whether it was works like Go Down Moses, which are a little more clear and streamlined, or something much more stream of consciousness like As I Lay Dying, Even the Sound and the Fury, or Absalom. Certainly, I think there's a huge parallel between Joe Christmas and Light in August, from what I understand of that. That'll be the last Faulkner novel I read. And the character of Bliss. I think Morrison's work, Love, probably comes closest to what Ellison was going for with his sort of more stream of consciousness modernist style. Peter Mathiessen's Shadow Country, not just for the way that he explores it, and particularly the way that he ends this book with E.J. Watson sort of facing his death, and the way that I think Callahan has allowed Ellison to achieve a sort of ending for Bliss in Juneteenth, but also the fact that this is an example of almost a parallel of the best case scenario for what Ellison might have accomplished, where Matthiessen literally wrote a trilogy of novels, spent some time later on revising, reworking them, put it together in a better form in Shadow Country, and it's an absolute masterpiece. Ellison in some ways was trying to create a trilogy of novels and was never quite editing it and getting it tight enough to be published. I think James Joyce's Ulysses is a huge influence. Certainly, I think the novel of ideas in The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann feels very close to where Ellison is going for. He sort of moved from 19th century influences in the novel with Dostoevsky into the 20th century. Something like Minor Notes, this might be a good publication for someone who's interested in Black poetry that isn't necessarily poets who are super famous. Penguin Classics has been reworking some new works that bring voices back that had sort of just disappeared through the cracks. This was a Christmas gift from my wife. Harold Brodkey is another contemporary and parallel to Ellison. His stories in an almost classical mode reveal numerous attempts to revise the same roughly 4 stories over and over and over, and just cut deeper and add more details and embellishments to the stories. And he would later publish a novel called The Runaway Soul that's absolutely terrible and dreadful. I don't recommend it. But his stories here reveal an interesting reworking of a book that he could never quite finish, whether it was A Party of Animals or The Animal Corner or whatever it was going to be. Baldwin reveals a very different path from Ellison, a path where he's very open about how Richard Wright influenced him, and I think was a little more confrontational in his grasp of language. He had grown up in the Black church and had all of these experiences that he would use in his novels, but he went in a very different direction, both in his essays and in his stories. The sermons that are in Juneteenth are phenomenal. If you want more examples of that, Library of America has a great anthology. I would say that the story Chronicle of the Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez comes close to approximating what Ellison was achieving in Juneteenth. I think Juneteenth is far superior to Chronicle of the Death Foretold. And another contemporary work would be The Known World by Edward P. Jones. Finally, I think someone who went in a very different direction from Ellison, but as Ellison, in the intervening 40 years, writers like Baldwin were producing works, Toni Morrison. There was also Ishmael Reed, whether it was with Yellowback Radio, Brokedown, or Mumbo Jumbo, both just sort of surreal, very unconventional experimental works that reveal Reed's much more satiric, ironic tone than the type of avenue that Ellison was going. And finally, probably the single work I was thinking of most was Omen Setter's Luck from William Gass. The way that there's this conflict with a minister as a central character. And this in some ways is a sort of almost 20th century response to, I think, the Scarlet Letter. But the way that they use language and that they use this idea of this morality play taking place, not unlike what Ellison is doing. And then finally, one last comparison would have been what Samuel Beckett, I think, did with his trilogy, particularly with Malloy, and Malone Dies, I think. The way that he is taking Joyce's influence and then trying to go in a different direction and make it his own is, I think, something Ellison did marvelously with these passages from Juneteenth. So let me know if anyone else has read this. I was looking for other folks on BookTube who've read this one. I absolutely loved it. I'm going to read 3 days before the shooting at some point. And I want to share specifically some thoughts around Cadillac Flambe, which I think deserves its own piece, as probably does the chapter that forms Juneteenth, the chapter that forms Blues' Birth, even the chapter that forms Night Talk. There's so much rich writing, so many rich ideas, and just brilliant passages that make up Juneteenth. So, as I said, please check it out if you're interested. Hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.